The committee will come to order, a quorum being present. We will now continue today's business. Now, pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 4537. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 4537, to preserve the state-based system of insurance regulation.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Duffy, the sponsor of the legislation, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I first want to say thank you to Mr. Heck for all of his hard work and partnership on this bill. We've gone through a number of different drafts and revisions, trying to make today happen and bring this to a bipartisan bill. Also, I want to thank Mr. Capuano. We've had a number of meetings, and we had a number of little wrinkles as we've gone through the last couple of days, but want to thank him for his work on this legislation and his willingness to work in such a bipartisan fashion. Hopefully we'll have a great, strong bipartisan vote today. I strongly believe that we must protect the U.S. system of insurance regulation as its primary goal of policyholder protection in solvency regulation. We've already entered into our first covered agreement with the EU, and I believe that agreement comports with everything we're trying to do in this legislation. This bill will make sure that the state-based system of insurance regulation is protected by our representatives when negotiating international agreements and standards. It also ensures that our state insurance commissioners are closely consulted and included in the process. Finally, it provides for consultation with Congress, with all of us, and a disapproval process mirroring the process used for trade agreements. Opponents of the legislation have opined that they think that Section 3 of the legislation would limit our ability to negotiate with the international community. Absolutely not true. I maintain that we must protect our state-based system from imprudent regulatory standards that could disrupt our marketplace while entering into any negotiations. Section 3 is the strongest part of this bill in terms of ensuring our system is protected. Even so, we added a clause so there is no confusion that we will be able to participate in negotiations. Section 3, specifically, I've heard that the legislation is too prescriptive in terms of being, quote, consistent with and reflective of federal and state laws. And so later I'll be offering an amendment that will read it'll be consistent with and reflective of the United States system of insurance regulation. A small tweak, but trying to alleviate some of the concerns that folks had with regard to the language. I strongly believe that Congress should have a direct say as to whether the United States should enter into an international agreement, much like we do with trade agreements, in order to ensure that we are getting the best deal for our constituents. Now, while the EU had a vote on the covered agreement, all of us here in Congress, we didn't have a vote. So the EU gets to vote. They're empowered to say yes or no, but we here in the U.S. Congress are not. I think that's a huge mistake. I want to leave you with a statement from the Treasury Department on the most recent covered agreement, and they said, quote, the agreement affirms the U.S. system of insurance regulation, including the role of state insurance regulators as the primary supervisors of the business of insurance, end quote. We must make sure that this statement made about any international insurance agreement we enter into is always made. We want to make sure we're consistent with our state-based regulatory system. Again, I want to thank my partners across the aisle. I want to thank Mr. Luke DeMeyer, the former subcommittee chairman of this committee, for his hard work and input. I think we have a bill that's better and not only has the opportunity to get out of this committee, but get across the floor, but get the sometimes or oftentimes inactive Senate to actually see the bipartisan vote here and hopefully pick this up and move it. If I could just, for the record, Mr. Chairman, also include letters of support from the NAIC, NAMIC, the Big I, PCI, and PIA, I would be grateful for that, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose, gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
Move to strike last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to start out by quickly saying thank you to everyone who has worked so incredibly hard on this bill to get the text right, and especially Chairman Duffy and Luca Meyer, and of course the bipartisan, ever bipartisan Mr. Capiano. Thank you to one and all. We've made a lot of changes, actually, and this has been a collaborative, bipartisan process at its finest. I'm proud to be a part of it. It's the way this process ought to work. Thank you for your leadership, Chairman Duffy. Let me acknowledge at the outset, this issue is weird. It's weird. I'm sure it's a little frustrating to many of you. The states got to just about every field of financial services regulation before the federal government did, but in much of our work, the feds are now dominant. Banks were chartered and supervised by states long before the first federal bank regulators came along in the 1860s. But of course, today, the dual banking system tilts more and more heavily toward federal power. Similarly, securities were first regulated under blue sky laws decades before the Securities Act in 1933. But today, the SEC has preempted nearly all state securities regulation, but not insurance. In insurance, we have stuck with and repeatedly recommitted to state-based regulation of insurance. And we've done that because it works. It works really well. We have a flourishing industry with insurers of all sizes and structures. We have strong policyholder protections. We have an effective coordinated body in the form of NAIC. But it does mean we have to set up different rules in the international realm. International negotiations will inevitably involve the federal government because that's one of its roles under the Constitution. But when international negotiations cover insurance, they must also involve our primary insurance regulators, and that is the states, and that's what this bill is all about. In the securities realm, we can just delegate a lot of this to the SEC to figure out. They sit at international tables representing both the federal government and the primary securities regulator. Life is simple. For insurance, we have to set up different system, and we need rules that reflect that. So this bill really does two things. It requires that state insurance commissioners be consulted in international negotiations on insurance regulations, regardless of whether the negotiations reach an agreement that is binding or non-binding. It ensures that changes to the U.S. system of insurance regulation are made in Washington, D.C., or Madison, or Olympia, or Austin, or Sacramento. It ensures that those changes are made here or in the states, but not in an international forum. This bill is decidedly not intended to stop international agreements. In fact, it's important to remind everyone we have a good idea of what sort of agreements we would get under this bill. Because prior to the financial crisis, the U.S., represented by state insurance commissioners, concluded numerous agreements at the IAIS, or International Association of Insurance Supervisors. Insurance Concordat, September 97. Principles on Capital Adequacy and Solvency, January 2002. Supervision of Insurance Activities on the Internet, October 2004. And the U.S., represented by the U.S. Trade Rep, consulted closely with state insurance regulators, entered into numerous free trade agreements that recognize the U.S. system of insurance regulation. NAFTA in 1994, Japan Insurance Measures, also 94, Singapore 2004. In fact, Mr. Chair, with your permission, I'd like to enter into the record the list of more than 20 agreements that were in fact entered into with consultation with state insurance commissioners prior to 2010, if I may.
Without objection.
Now, in the post-Dodd-Frank world, the Fed and the FIO are often participating in these international forums as well. We're not looking to change that, but they need to do a better job of coordinating and consulting, and we want to ensure that they're building on the long pre-crisis track record of negotiating agreements that preserve the state-based system of insurance, not upend it. And this bill is narrowly tailored toward two of its two goals: effective communication between the feds and the primary regulators, and preserving the authority of legislatures to structure insurance regulation. In fact, this bill is supported by your insurance commissioners and by insurers in your state. It preserves America's proven insurance model, and that is why I humbly ask for your support. And with that, I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and I'd like to thank Chairman Duffy and Representative Heck for their work on the International Insurance Standards Act. It is not easy to reach bipartisan consensus on the issue. There are legitimate and passionate disagreements over what the future of the Federal Insurance Office should look like, and I believe my friends from Washington and Wisconsin should be commended for coming together, listening to the thoughts and concerns of their colleagues, and striking a good deal for the American people. Now, it's regrettable that we could not get all the interested parties to agree on the bill's language, and I do hope that productive conversations we've had can continue before the bill reaches the House floor. But nonetheless, I support the current legislation and would encourage my colleagues to report it favorably out of committee. There are two key aspects of this bill I'd like to first highlight. First, the legislation would provide Congress with the authority to conduct meaningful oversight of international negotiations related to insurance. Sections 5, 6, and 7 in the bill would create formal mechanisms allowing Congress to uphold its responsibility under our Constitution to participate in the regulation of commerce with foreign nations, ensuring that international insurance agreements receive the same due diligence from this body as other trade agreements. During the last administration, many of us were frustrated by the lack of transparency and engagement from FIO and Fed negotiators during the covered agreement process. By mandating certain notifications and providing Congress with an option to disapprove of a negotiated agreement, we will recapture much of the legislative authority that has been delegated out of our hands in recent years. This is an important change and one that I believe I can support. Look, when America enters into trade agreements with foreign nations, states don't give up their regulatory authority, nor do Americans lose their protections for consumer protections that they have in each state. Each state is different and allows insurance to tailor their products to different circumstances is truly a strength and not a weakness in our marketplace. Second, I would like to highlight the protections for our state-based system of insurance regulation included in H.R. 4537. As some of you may know, the National Association of Insurance Commissioners, which represents our state insurance regulators, was a founding member of the International Association of Insurance Supervisors when it was formed in 1994. The NAIC helped set up the international institution to support our allies in their attempts to provide to their countrymen the same robust insurance market enjoyed by American citizens. For that reason, it is a bit ironic that under our current laws, the IAIS presents a potential backdoor method for undermining the primacy of our state insurance commissioners and fundamentally reforming our state-based system. I believe the language in Section 3 of the Act, which reiterates the duty of federal representatives to uphold our state-based system, will effectively ensure we do not leave behind our proven method of insurance regulation simply to accommodate our international partners. After all, my home state of Florida has the 18th largest economy in the world, and I'd bet an insurance market the size which would rival many of the nations preceding us on that list. To minimize Florida's ability to participate in the IAIS seems both unnecessary and unreasonable. Could this commitment to the state-based system complicate international negotiations? Perhaps, but I'd much rather err on the side of more stakeholder input than continue to support a system that minimizes the ability of my state's insurance regulator to protect the constituents it serves. By mitigating that threat and reasserting Congress's voice in the realm of international commerce, H.I. 4537 represents a much-needed reform to our current system. Mr. Chairman, I again reiterate my strong support for these reforms made by this legislation and urge my colleagues to vote yes on H.R. 4537, and I yield back.
Would you yield to the chairman?
I yield to the chairman.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I want to thank the gentleman from Wisconsin, the chairman of our HI subcommittee, for his leadership here, and his predecessor, the gentleman from Illinois, the gentleman from Washington, and other members on the other side of the aisle for working together on this bipartisan bill. I do think quickly it achieves two important goals: to reiterate the primacy of our state-based insurance regulatory system, and to ensure that Congress has a greater voice and oversight into the system of international negotiations to oversee what our U.S. negotiators are doing and to ensure that they are commensurate with that state-based system. So I think there are a number of improvements that are encapsulated in H.R. 4537, and I would encourage members on both sides of the aisle to support. I thank the gentleman from Florida. I yield back to the gentleman from Florida.
I yield back.
And he yields back.
Mr. Chairman.
Who seeks recognition. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, as you know, I also serve as the ranking member on the Agriculture Committee, which handles the derivatives cross-border and deal very closely with the European Union negotiating with the United States. So I want to bring a little bit of insight to this from my perspective to let you know why this bill is important. First of all, I think in order to understand what we have before us, we have to know what covered agreement is. That is the centerpiece of what we're dealing with. And the covered agreement is just one big regulatory fight ongoing between the European Union insurance regulators and our United States regulators. Now, why this is important is because of this, we are trying to prevent our United States insurance marketplace here in the United States from too often being placed under tremendous pressure because the other international regulators do not fully understand our country's unique laws and regulations. This is even further compounded now when you have the exit of Great Britain from the EU. It makes it even more problematic. So I want to commend Mr. Duffy and Mr. Heck, my two good friends here. And I want to say that the goal of the covered agreement, something I'm strongly supportive of, is to make sure that insurers and reinsurers operating in either jurisdiction, whether they're operating in the EU, whether they're operating in the United States, can keep business moving fluidly between both the United States and the EU. Now, let me be crystal clear. I'm strongly supportive of the covered agreement. I'm strongly supportive of the insurance work we did in Dodd-Frank, like setting up the Treasury Insurance Office called IFO, or IHO, I believe, but it's FIO. However, no matter how well-intentioned this work was that we did, or how a covered agreement was, the reality is this: no law is perfect, and things change. Who would ever thought when we made this law that Great Britain would exit from the EU? That has profound implications. And more importantly, throughout the covered agreement negotiations, our insurance marketplace here in the United States, again, as I mentioned, was put under undue pressure. Even right now, when we talk about our clearinghouses, there is no equalization or equivalency between the EU and the United States that we've been battling on for years. So what I am simply saying is that when you have a situation where the European Union and other international groups are having difficulty with understanding the complexities of our laws, you got to remember we are the #1 economic system in the world. And a part of that is because we have 50 states. And each of these 50 states have different types of regulations. And so, as I said, I'm a strong supporter of this. Again, I want to thank the lead sponsors on this, Mr. Heck and Mr. Duffy, and I would urge the committee to adopt this measure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from Utah seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
I would just like to express my support for H.R. 4537, the International Insurance Standards Act. I'd like to thank Chairman Duffy for bringing up this important piece of legislation. The United States, as everyone knows well, has a very unique system of state-based insurance regulation. I've been a strong proponent of that system, which has been serving policyholders well, and which have been providing an effective framework for ensuring the proper functioning of our insurance marketplace. And very importantly, the system allows states to play a central role in protecting the sometimes unique interests of their local consumers. And so it's been a detrimental development to see that that system was undermined in a way that has pushed the voice of state regulators into the background when it comes to representing the United States in international standard-setting discussions for insurance industry. H.R. 4537 will correct that trend by, first of all, reaffirming the intent of Congress to support our state-based system of insurance regulation. This bill would require federal agencies to consult closely with states and prohibit federal agencies from agreeing to an international standard unless it's consistent with the state and federal law recognizes U.S. law as complying. Second, I appreciate that this bill will increase transparency and accountability regarding U.S. participation in international discussions over insurance regulations. It will require coordination between federal agencies and state regulators to ensure that the latter remain central to the process. Significantly, it will also ensure that Congress maintains oversight of the U.S. participation in these international standard-setting discussions. I thank you, Mr. Chairman Duffy, for introducing this legislation. I believe that our states will play a bigger role when it comes to these international standards, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yield?
Would the gentlelady yield to the gentleman from Michigan?
Sure. I yield to the gentleman from Michigan.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate the words, and I just want to add my 2 cents as a former state legislator who served for 3 terms in Michigan, saw the importance of it, the diligence of the regulators there, saw the care that was put into that. I just want to commend Chairman Duffy and Mr. Heck and others for acknowledging that strong state role in the process of insurance regulation and to uphold that principle that we must adhere to that if we do enter into these international agreements. And having spent some time over in Switzerland and with the IAIS, and it's clear they have a role to play. But coming from Michigan, the fine folks there don't understand lake effect snow. They don't understand car-deer crashes the way that we have in Michigan. They don't understand a lot of the elements, the culture, the locality that is unique to so many of our different states. And I think that this is an important step, and so I just want to commend the work that has been put forward. And with that, I yield back to the gentlelady.
I would like to yield to the sorry, Mr. Davidson. I don't know. Ohio, that's right.
Mr. Chairman, and I just want to commend our colleagues as well for working on this bipartisan embrace of federalism. I think the way the insurance markets are regulated in the United States reflect our constitutional form of government well. It shows the preeminence of states in our public life and in our markets. It shows in this act a rejection of international globalist power over the United States, and a check, an important check by this body as the lawmaking body on our regulatory agencies who have been tempted to act in a manner with limited accountability. So I really appreciate the work that makes it possible for us to have this final say in these agreements. I yield back to Ms. Love.
Thank you, Mr. Davidson, and I yield back to the chairman.
For what purpose does the gentlelady, the ranking member, seek recognition?
I move to strike the last.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman and members, I'd like to enter into a colloquy with Mr. Duffy on this bill. I think that there are some unanswered questions. I basically agree that we should be cognizant of our state insurance commissioners, and the fact that our states have different laws dealing with consumer protection and other kinds of things. But what I want to understand better is what do we do with a situation like AIG, where the states were not involved with any oversight of AIG. I believe the affiliate of AIG that operated in London had no oversight anywhere, I guess, in federal government. And so when we look at section, I think it is 3, Section 3, requirement that insurance standards reflect United States policy. Parties representing the federal government in any international regulatory standard setting or supervised reform or in any negotiations of any international agreements relating to the prudential aspects of insurance shall not agree to, accede to, accept, or establish, and to use their voice and vote, and shall vote to oppose any proposed argument or standard. Help me to understand, number one, kind of what I've alluded to with AIG, and also help me to understand that those persons, representing our federal government, do they have to come back here on any changes that are proposed? Is there any discussion on everything that's dealt with in these negotiations? How does it work?
Would the ranking member yield?
Yes.
Just on one of your points,
Yes.
with respect to AIG, and I
Yes.
can attempt to pull the transcript, but the now defunct OTS, Office of Thrift Supervision. You may recall a number of years ago that the head of OTS came before our committee, admitted that his agency had full authority over AIG, could have prevented the debacle at AIG, and they simply missed it. So they had full authority. Again, I can pull the transcript. So when you say how, you know, were they unregulated? No, they were regulated by the federal government, inadequately regulated, perhaps incompetently regulated. But we had the witness before us saying they had the full regulatory authority to deal with this subsidiary of AIG, and I just wanted to bring that to the ranking member's attention.
That. Continuing with Mr. Duffy, if our representatives think that what is being proposed is good for this country, they will be prevented from agreeing to anything while they're there in negotiations, et cetera. How would they then accept or agree with, since they're prohibited from doing anything or accepting anything? How would they do that if they think it's good for us?
I think the ranking member for yielding, just quickly, if this colloquy goes well, are we going to get you to yes? Is this
I'm sorry.
If this colloquy goes well, are we going to get you to yes? Maybe
Please,
yes.
Mr. Duffy, just deal with it.
We've to the ranking member, we've based our language off the process that's already used for trade agreements. And as we know, our two tax writing committees have the ability to review and approve trade agreements that our country enters into. And I do think it's important that, yes, if the American people didn't elect a regulator, they elected us. And we empower regulators to go work on our behalf, but I do think it's important for us to have a say in the final product. And I do believe that there's some large international companies that would prefer to have just one blanket regulation, a federal regulatory model. And I think a lot of us come at this from the state-based perspective, where the system has worked really well for 150 years. We did well in the 08 crisis, and we don't want to cash that model in, and we just want to protect it, and that's all we're trying to do here. And I think in California, you would probably agree with that as well, and I know your time is up.
For purposes of colloquy, I ask unanimous consent that the ranking member be granted another additional 5 minutes without objection.
Thank you very much. I would like to support this bill, I would like to understand better how this prohibition in Section 3 does not allow our representatives to agree to anything, and when they decide that perhaps what is being proposed would be beneficial, how does it get back to us?
Will the ranking member yield? Down here?
Yes, I'd be happy to yield.
Thank you. I would just remind you that the Federal Insurance Office was established in Dodd-Frank not to offer oversight, but to negotiate covered agreements so that U.S. insurers, primarily reinsurers, could do business overseas, primarily in Europe. And I agree with you, there was obviously a massive failure at AIG, but that wasn't a failure of insurance regulation. The insurance regulators actually protected policyholders by refusing to release funds that AIG tried to take out of their New York insurers to deal with their other problems. The New York regulator said no. And so AIG was a failure to regulate their financial products.
Okay, now, reclaiming my time, I have someone here on my side, Mr. Capuano, who's just chopping at the bit to
Look,
get involved.
I'm getting to yes, but you're pushing me away. You want to rewrite history, let's do it another time. Yeah, that is not the history I see of the AIG debacle, and I'm going to speak on it at my time, but honestly, you want me to get to yes? I suggest you be quiet now.
Reclaiming my time, Mr. Duffy, let's get back to just you and I. All right. My question remains, if they are prohibited from agreeing to anything, but they see that what is being proposed would be good for this country, then what happens? What do they do?
Again, we do it just like a trade agreement. And I would note, first of all, we can take the temperature down a little bit. We're all in agreement here. Let's not lose sight of that. We want them to protect the state-based model. We think that's important. And again, just like in the last covered agreement, where you and I and the chairman didn't have a vote, the EU actually did. They got a vote on that. So we're saying, agree.
All right, reclaiming my time. Mr. Heck, would you help me out with this? Mr. Heck? Did you hear the concern?
And first of all, let me acknowledge how completely legitimate the concerns are, especially given the magnitude of the impact that the AIG failure caused, that we would be concerned about that going forward. I happen to share the chair's perspective that this was, in fact, a failure of the Office of Thrift Supervision and its incompetence. You use that word as a perhaps. I will assert that word. But to the ranking member, I just want to answer the direct question of how is it that the process works such that we can get there by, again, referencing the list, as Chairman Duffy alluded to, of the more than 20 times in which we did this pre-2010, exactly as we more or less contemplate in this legislation. We did this through, for example, the trade rep, and we did it with NAFTA, we did it with U.S., Japan, and Jordan, Australia, Chile, Singapore, Bahrain, Morocco, Oman, Peru, the Dominican Republic, Panama, Colombia, and the Republic of Korea. We managed to do this, to involve our state-based regulatory structure successfully in each and every one of these. They're separate. That wasn't just a one-off. So there is ample precedent, I believe, of being able to involve our pre-existing regulatory structure to successful completion in the international forum, both in the international agreements, which are separate from the trade agreements, but the trade agreements really, I think, is more directly analogous to your concern about how would the process work.
Okay, reclaiming my time, I would like to support this bill, but I would also like to ask both Mr. Duffy and Mr. Heck, will you continue to work with me prior to the floor to see if I can get further clarifications or offer perhaps something that I think would give us the opportunity to understand better how we would be able to better define how we go about acceptance of proposals that would benefit this country, despite the fact they're prohibited in the negotiations from doing it. So if I could get that agreement, I would support the bill.
To the ranking member, I absolutely would be delighted to work with you between now and the time we go to the floor, and I appreciate your willingness to work with Mr. Heck and myself, and we would love to have your support. And
Thank you, Mr. Heck, also. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that.
Time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I first want to thank and congratulate the hard work that Chairman Duffy and Mr. Heck have put in on this, and the rest of my colleagues on this committee, to make sure that there is proper transparency and accountability for international insurance negotiations. I'm supportive of this bill, but I must say I'm somewhat torn in how we address this important topic. On one hand, I'm strongly supportive of the state-based system of regulating insurance that we have here in the United States. This is a system that is working and is working very well for the insurance marketplace and consumers from Illinois, where I'm from. On the other hand, we need to recognize that we are operating in a global economy and that the world is not flat. We need to be very conscious of how we are positioning the United States to compete on the world stage. It's not the first time this committee has considered legislation to increase transparency and accountability for international insurance negotiations. In the 114th, there were at least 114th Congress, there are at least 2 bills put forward recommending improvements to these processes. I co-sponsored legislation authored by both Chairman Luke DeMeyer and also Chairman Duffy out of recognition that it was important to have more oversight and transparency over the negotiations of recently signed covered agreements and other ongoing negotiations. And many of my colleagues who were here last Congress felt the same. This issue has generally enjoyed bipartisan support. Earlier this year, we heard testimony in the Housing and Insurance Subcommittee from the chairman of NAMIC that, and I quote, "The overreach of a group of mostly foreign policymakers exerting their vision of regulation on our banking system is particularly troubling for the U.S. property casualty insurance industry," end quote. Multilateral, I'll continue the quote here actually, multilateral organizations like the FSB have always been intended to promote and foster economic growth while maintaining financial stability, not to regulate financial services markets everywhere in the world. Over the last decade, the movement towards more formulaic, prescriptive, and intrusive standard development has accelerated at an alarming rate, end quote. During the negotiation of the covered agreement between the United States and Europe, I heard concerns that the process was nowhere nearly as transparent as it should have been. That being said, despite some concerns about the process, the covered agreement was a positive outcome for all interested parties. In fact, I understand every stakeholder in the United States is supportive or at least neutral. Negotiations need to involve some give and take, and that's exactly what has happened. To my knowledge, this is our only major case study for whether or not our processes for international negotiations are working, at least in a post-Dodd-Frank environment with the creation of a federal insurance office and increased authority to pursue such agreements. We need to make sure any legislation that would make changes to how the U.S. can enter international agreements regarding insurance regulations strengthens the hands of negotiators and U.S. interests. We should never weaken it. Too many restrictions may unintentionally make it more difficult for our representatives to reach good deals. Furthermore, foreign counterparts may not be willing to deal with our representatives if they believe our representatives are not empowered decision makers. However, I understand that this is largely how the Europeans have approached negotiations. When they came to the table, they explained that their laws prohibit them from conceding certain points, thus making this the starting point for negotiations. I'm a bit wary of both sides putting in place such restrictions around negotiations. We have a global economy and global insurance markets. We also cannot foresee what international agreements might need to be reached in the future. For these reasons, I am also grateful for a number of the changes that have been mentioned and have been made in this legislation. For example, the new version of the bill includes language in Section 3 stating, and I quote, "Nothing in this section shall be construed to prevent participation in negotiations of any proposed agreement or standard," end quote. This is helpful given some of the other language used in this section. For example, I've been concerned about how some of the language requiring consensus among the states. I do not believe this should permit for tyranny of the minority for international negotiations to take place. Additionally, I want to point that just because something is inconsistent and does not reflect existing federal, state laws, regulations, and policies on regulation of insurance does not mean it needs to be identical. I wanted to see if I could enter quickly with Chairman Duffy, if you have a second. Can I ask you a quick question on the record? Sorry about that. And I apologize for interrupting your conversation there, but I did want to just provide some clarity and see if you'd make a statement on the point that just because something is, and I quote from the bill, inconsistent and does not reflect existing federal state laws, regulations, and policies on regulation of insurance does not mean it needs to be identical. Is that your understanding? So it's not requiring identical language.
I believe that's correct if I heard your question correctly.
Okay. And we can talk further on that. But thank you for that. Again, I support this legislation. Thank you, Chairman Duffy, for your work. I know it's been a struggle, but I think it's an important end product, and I support it and encourage my colleagues to support it as well. I yield back.
For what purpose, gentleman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, look, since we're talking a little history, I couldn't agree more that the OTS did fall down on the job during 2008 crisis. But let's be clear, so did state regulators. The state regulators, particularly in New York, could have said that the intricate derivatives that AIG was doing, and doing alone at the time, were subject to regulation. They chose not to do that. There's plenty of blame to go around, federal and state. So let's get over it. You want to blame one or the other? Have fun, go at it. But we are where we are, whether you like it or not. So, and by the way, I actually think that one of the ways we can keep this from happening again with insurance companies that get out of their lane. AIG was so far beyond the lane of a typical insurance company, it's ridiculous, but between the combination of FIO and OFR and the state regulators and FSOC, they now have the clear and unequivocal authority to keep an eye when an insurance company gets out of the lane. I'm not aware of anyone who has suggested that insurance companies who stayed in the lane of providing straight, plain, vanilla insurance contributed to the problems we had in 2008. That wasn't the problem. But that doesn't mean that those insurance companies are somehow prohibited from doing it again. There's no prohibition from them doing it again. Therefore, we need people to keep an eye on that part of the activity, number one. Number two, I'd like to associate myself with the comments of Mr. Hultgren. I couldn't agree more. I don't have any problem with the state-based regulation system, but I also think that whether you like it or not, the world is shrinking. We need to have international discussions. We need to have conversations with other people about how they do things, how our businesses and their businesses, not just in insurance, on everything, but not excluding insurance. So whether you like it or not, the world is shrinking, and it will continue to shrink, and there will come another day, probably further down the road, when we will have to revisit this issue again and again and again because the state-based system might become obsolete. It's not today, but it might well be. So with all that being said, let me be clear why I think this is a decent piece of legislation. I have always been for transparency. It is not unique to the previous administration for the lack of transparency. If you don't believe me, call the FCC today with what they are doing with net neutrality. They are ignoring the fact that they have received millions upon millions of fake comments, including one allegedly from my own wife that submitted a comment on a side that she doesn't agree with. But the FCC will have none of that. They're going to do what they're going to do on net neutrality no matter what. So you want to talk about lack of transparency, it's all over government, number one. Number two, as far as congressional input, I agree, which is why I voted to get rid of the so-called super IPAB on the health insurance bill. I'm a great defender of the health insurance bill. I thought that provision was always wrong because it took away congressional oversight. I happen to think that earmarks are a good thing for the very same reason. I think Congress should have input on how our federal dollars are spent in a very detailed way. So I agree on transparency, I agree on congressional oversight, and I couldn't agree more on the concept of trying to get different levels of government to coordinate. State, local, and federal should try to work together whenever possible. There's nothing wrong with that. That's a good thing. I think this bill is a step in that direction. All that being said, I think the ranking member makes some good questions. Those questions, many of them I think can't be answered right now. So to a certain extent, this is a leap of faith. I have no problem with this. If we get to a problem, I'll be the first to say, whoops, it's a problem, let's step back. I don't think that's the case. Number one. Number two is I'm trying to get to yes. In a minute, I'm going to defend my partisan, bona fides because I think I have to. But it is good to get to yes when you can. And that's what this bill is. I will give Mr. Duffy, Mr. Heck credit. They came up with a bill, but they were more than willing to have discussions on how to change it a little bit. Not dramatic, but some basic changes. And I appreciate that very much. I hope that that means we'll be able to get to work on flood insurance, and I hope we get to work on the real definition of what a real community bank is so we can fix some of those problems. But that's an argument for tomorrow. In my last 25 seconds, I do have to defend my partisanship to some degree. I would like, at some point, for the debt clock to come back up while I'm speaking. Why? Because it's now been 327 days since my Republican friends have taken over the House, the Senate, and the White House, and on every day, you have added $1.7 billion to the national debt without fail, and it continues to go up.
I yield 1 minute.
The gentleman has
you to add another $2.5 trillion, 20% tomorrow.
The time of the gentleman has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
You know, just looking at that clock, you know, we have had some obstruction in the Senate as we look for some fiscal responsibility, particularly as we work to defend this nation. And the idea of tying our defense budget to domestic side, there's no correlation at all. We have men and women in the field defending this country. We have pressed for a full funding of our defense bill, but it seems that the Senate, certain members of the Senate, seem to hold that hostage. But that's besides the point. That's not why I moved to strike the last word. I want to commend Representatives Duffy and Heck for their work on this legislation. There's an important provision in here, Section 6. Under our Constitution, it is the Congress that establishes rules of commerce. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution provides that the Congress shall have the power to, among other things, regulate commerce with foreign nations. Current law, however, gives Congress no say in the current covered agreement process, which covered agreements regulate commerce among foreign nations. Representative Duffy's bill, which I'm co-sponsoring, is a step forward to address this constitutional defect in the current framework. This issue is of utmost importance, for it deals with a bedrock principle of this republic, that is government of, by, and for the people, acting through their elected representatives. It's about self-rule versus rules by elites in Washington, D.C. I look forward to continuing to address this particular issue as this legislation continues to move forward, and I urge my colleagues to support this bill. And I would yield back the balance.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose? Gentleman from Massachusetts seek recognition.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start off you know, I'm one of those members who was here during the AIG debacle, and I just want to be clear here. The New York insurance regulator had primary responsibility to regulate AIG. It wasn't OTS. If you look at OTS's jurisdiction, it is limited to federal, you know, chartering federal thrifts. If you look at all the filings by AIG leading up to and during and after all their problems, it was always, you know, consent agreements with the New York insurance regulator. And that was our problem. AIG was operating in 80 different countries, and there was a real mismatch between the scope of the regulator, the New York Insurance Commissioner, and the work that AIG was doing around the globe. It was just sheer inability to get a hold of that organization and to stop them from what they were doing, or to even understand what they were doing. So I want to get to this bill, Mr. Heck and Mr. Duffy, and I want to thank you for all the work you've put in here. And I'm actually leaning yes on this bill, but I do want to point out what the ranking member has suggested, and that is that there are parts of the insurance business and the industry that are very, very important to have local input. You know, policy protections, consumer protections, things that are more local in the insurance business. It is very important that the states have a role in that. but also the example of AIG where these insurance companies can get so big and act so far afield that we simply, if we put all of the power in our local states, God bless them, to regulate an international, a global organization, it doesn't work very well, and AIG is a perfect example of that. So what I'm suggesting here is that, look, I understand what you're trying to do, but I also want to point out the gaps that you're creating in this bill, and that is that we are going to give each and every state a veto, basically. It's built into this legislation under Section 3 where whatever our negotiators agree to, it has to be consistent with and compliant with the insurance laws of all 50 states. So that's going to be problematic.
Would the gentleman yield?
Sure I would.
Yeah,
sure I would. Yeah,
I'm
absolutely.
going to have an amendment that'll tweak that language. That concern was brought up, and so yeah, we don't want to make sure it's consistent with all 50 states, and I think we've addressed that concern. So
Okay, great. Well, that's great to hear. That's my main concern. I do think that there is another dimension here, like my friend Mr. Capuano has said. You know, the world is shrinking, and we're going to have to deal with some of these other countries on the insurance realm in a way that protects all of our citizens, and that we create a workable system that allows our regulators to get in there and negotiate. I do fully support Section 5, where you have, you know, consultation with Congress, where they have to come back here and talk to us, and we are the representatives of all the states, and we can certainly measure whether our citizens are being protected. So I think that's a very good provision, and I approve it. I wish we had this in a more meaningful role in trade agreements here in Congress, instead of just an up or down vote on you know, giving the U.S. trade representative the ability to cut some of these agreements. But to that degree, I do want to thank the gentleman for their good work on this bill, and I'll yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose? Gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not going to take the bait on debating what happened to AIG a decade ago. I see it differently, but I would say this, that complex financial service companies require more than one kind of regulator. And I don't think the answer is to force U.S. companies to do one thing only. You know, if you're going to do insurance, you can't do anything else in financial services. That's not going to make us competitive on the world stage. And I would remind my friends on the other side that FIO was not established as a regulator. That's not FIO's role. FIO is more akin to the U.S. trade representative role in the insurance space than it is to some kind of federal regulator of insurance. And with that in mind, I want to thank Mr. Duffy for making changes to the bill. I spent the better part of my life in the insurance industry. It's very dear to me, and it's meant a great deal to me. And I lived in the state-based system. I lived under the regulation of 50 regulators, which was difficult at times. But I always preferred that because it's more responsive when you're dealing with state regulators. I do appreciate the chairman's sensitivity in making changes to the bill. When I read the first version of it, I was very concerned that it would be impossible for FIO to cut any kind of a deal on behalf of U.S. reinsurers doing business overseas. The original language was so tight that you could make the argument that unless FIO was consistent with the law of all 50 states, plus any federal laws, that they couldn't cut a deal. And I appreciate the chairman actually making changes that I think get the right balance now. FIO doesn't have to be precisely in line with all 50 states, as Mr. Holtgren was pointing out, but they do have to recognize the primacy of state-based regulation, and they do have to do what they do without conflicting with existing laws. And I think the changes in Section 3 are really vital. We haven't talked a lot about Section 7, but I think the changes there are maybe even more important, because the way it's written now, it's clear that FIO can't make agreements, covered agreements to allow business to be done overseas that also change the way U.S.-only insurers do business here. And I think removing certain parts of Section 7 make it clear that FIO is empowered to enter into covered agreements that allow U.S. insurers to succeed overseas, but the rest of the insurance industry here in the States doesn't have themselves tied up in knots because of those deals. And that is the right balance. That makes FIO an effective negotiator on behalf of the U.S. insurance industry without turning FIO into a regulator. And we don't need the heavy hand of Washington regulation on the insurance industry when we have very effective, not perfect, but very effective regulators in all 50 states. That's been a hallmark of the insurance industry from the beginning. So I appreciate the work of the chairman and the co-sponsor from Massachusetts, or from, I'm sorry, Mr. Heck, Washington, forgive me. I do appreciate your work together on the bill. I think it's a good bill. It's worthy of support. And with that, I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. For what purposes, the gentleman from Wisconsin seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
We'll pause and allow the amendment to be distributed. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Duffy in Section 3A, strike paragraph 1 and 2.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman is recognized on his amendment for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Obviously, Section 3 has come up in our conversation and debate today. Some concerns were brought to my attention, obviously, before today, so we've worked with many interested parties to tweak and modify that language. That's the purpose of this amendment. Those who have brought up those concerns, I think, for the most part, are okay with this clarification. And so, again, this is just a tweak to improve the clarity and functionality of this product. On a side note, I would just note, Mr. Chairman, that I don't think anybody in this committee has any concern about the partisan bona fides of Mr. Capuano. This bipartisan work and this collaboration will, I don't think, undermine that. And I just want the record to reflect that. I would yield back to the chairman.
Gentleman yields back. For a purpose, gentleman from Missouri seek recognition.
Move strike last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to offer my support for Chairman Duffy's amendment. I think he and Mr. Heck have done yeoman's work on getting this initiative to the floor. And this amendment, in my mind, certainly allays some concerns that I had with regards to some of the language and then what's in there. I know some of the concerns have been voiced here this morning with regards to allowing basically state regulation to trump what the negotiators were doing and just have one state that could do that. I think in this situation it allows for the ability of the negotiators to look at the state laws as a whole. And I think basically it clarifies the process. It allows more flexibility by the negotiators to do their job. It provides the oversight I believe is necessary to protect the American insurance industry and companies as well as consumers. At the end of the day, that's what we're all about, making sure we have a fair and ambitious marketplace for the consumers to be able to get all the products they need to be able to do their job and protect their families and insure their property. You know, also, there's another provision here at the end that I think clarifies the very last paragraph of the bill that I had some concerns about that I believe is a nice compromise that, again, puts, I think, in place allays the concerns of a lot of folks with regards to, again, the consultation necessary by different groups to be involved. And I think Mr. Capuano made a good point a while ago with regards to this particular bill and any bill that we actually look at here in this committee. You know, today's marketplace changes every day. Our economy changes every day, and we need to be flexible. We need to understand that there is no such thing as a rigid rule that we need to continue to look at year after year after year without thinking that at some point we need to be able to tweak it, to change it, to make it more relevant, to make it enable it to be able to not hinder what's going on, but to actually embrace and enable things to be able to take place. There's another comment that I want to make sure that we follow up on. I think Mr. MacArthur made this point a while ago that I was getting ready to make as well. This bill is not about, you know, FIO becoming a regulatory agency. It's about FIO continuing to do its job as a negotiator. And I think we need to remember that the insurance folks are the ones that do the regulating, the state folks that do that. There are some federal folks that are engaged from the standpoint if you are doing business and expanding into other financial products and in other parts of the financial world, you wind up involving yourself in some federal regulatory folks and agencies. But for the most part, FIO is a negotiator. They're not a regulator, and I think this bill does a good job of keeping that in place. They continue to negotiate for the best interests of the United States insurance-based, individual state-based system, which is important to protect. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I certainly urge my support for this amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further debate on the amendment? For what purpose does the gentlelady from Ohio seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to now voice my support for this bill with the adoption of Mr. Duffy's amendments. I would also like to thank the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Duffy, but also I'd really like to thank my friend and classmate from Washington, Mr. Heck, for all of his hard work on this bill and for making modifications to Section 3 of this bill, which I thought could have been read as being too prescriptive. I believe the bill with the amended language will bolster our state-based insurance system and lead to a more transparent process when Team U.S. negotiates international standards. Thank you, Mr. Heck, Mr. Duffy, and Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Is there any further debate on the amendment? If not, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Duffy. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it and the amendment is adopted. Is there any further discussion on the underlying bill? If not, there being no further discussion or amendments to the bill, the question now occurs on ordering the bill as amended reported to the House with a favorable recommendation. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. For what purpose does the gentleman from Wisconsin seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I'd ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. A sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is so ordered, and pursuant to subsection C5, Rule 3 of the committee rules, the vote on this question is postponed. The committee stands in recess subject to the call of the chair. The chair anticipates we will reconvene to vote on pending measures in 10 minutes. The committee stands in recess.
American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act of 1996 and for other purposes.
Are the votes underway? The committee will come to order. The question now occurs on agreeing to the amendment offered by the gentle lady from Wisconsin, Ms. Moore, on which a recorded vote was ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. McHenry. Mr. King.
No.
Mr. King, no. Mr. Royce. Mr. Lucas. Mr. Royce. No. Mr. Royce, no. Mr. Lucas. No. Mr. Lucas, no. Mr. Pierce. Mr. Posey. No. Mr. Posey, no. Mr. Lukemeyer. No. Mr. Lukemeyer, no. Mr. Huizenga. No. Mr. Huizenga, no. Mr. Duffy. Mr. Stivers. No. Mr. Stivers, no. Mr. Hulkren. No. Mr. Hulkren, no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, no. Mr. Pittenger. No. Mr. Pittenger, no. Mrs. Wagner. No. Mrs. Wagner, no. Mr. Barr. No. Mr. Barr, no. Mr. Rothfuss. Mr. Rothfuss, no. Mr. Messer. Mr. Tipton. Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams, no. Mr. Poliquin. Mr. Poliquin, no. Mrs. Love. Mrs. Love, no. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, no. Mr. Emmer. Mr. Zeldin. Mr. Zeldin, no. Mr. Trott. Mr. Trott, no. Mr. Loudermilk. Mr. Loudermilk, no. Mr. Mooney. Mr. Mooney, no. Mr. MacArthur. Mr. MacArthur, no. Mr. Davidson. Mr. Davidson, no. Mr. Budd. Mr. Budd, no. Mr. Kustoff. Mr. Kustoff, no. Ms. Tenney. Ms. Tenney, no. Mr. Hollingsworth. Mr. Hollingsworth, no. Ms. Waters. Ms. Waters, aye. Mrs. Maloney. Mrs. Maloney, aye. Ms. Vasquez. Mr. Sherman. Mr. Sherman, aye. Mr. Meeks. Mr. Capuano. Mr. Capuano, aye. Mr. Clay. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, aye. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver, aye. Ms. Moore. Ms. Moore, aye. Mr. Ellison. Mr. Ellison, aye. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Himes. Mr. Himes, aye. Mr. Foster. Mr. Foster, aye. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, aye. Mr. Delaney. Mr. Delaney, aye. Ms. Cinema. Mrs. Beatty. Mrs. Beatty, aye. Mr. Heck. Mr. Heck, aye. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Vargas, aye. Mr. Gottheimer. Mr. Gottheimer, aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, aye. Mr. Christ. Mr. Christ, aye. Mr. Kewen. Mr. Kewen, aye. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Chairman, no.
Good tweet.
Is there any member who has not voted? Gentleman from North Carolina.
Mr. McHenry.
No.
Mr. McHenry, no.
Gentleman from Wisconsin.
Mr. Duffy, no.
Gentleman from Indiana.
Mr. Messer, no.
Gentleman from Minnesota.
Mr. Emmer. Mr. Emmer, no.
Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Meeks. Mr.
Gentlelady from Arizona.
Ms. Cinema, aye.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Lynch, aye.
Is there any other member who has not voted? Is there any member who wishes to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will report. Okay.
Mr. Chairman, the ayes are 24 and the nays are 32.
The amendment then is not agreed to. The question now occurs on adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the gentleman from New Mexico, Mr. Pierce. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. The question now occurs on reporting the bill favorably to the House as amended. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Mexico seek recognition? Recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. A sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. McHenry. Mr. McHenry, aye. Mr. King. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Royce. Mr. Royce, aye. Mr. Lucas. Mr. Lucas, aye. Mr. Pierce. Mr. Pierce, aye. Mr. Posey. Mr. Posey, aye. Mr. Lukemeyer. Mr. Lukemeyer, aye. Mr. Huizenga. Mr. Huizenga, aye. Mr. Duffy. Mr. Duffy, aye. Mr. Stivers. Mr. Stivers, aye. Mr. Hulkren. Mr. Hulkren, aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, aye. Mr. Pittenger. Mr. Pittenger, aye. Mrs. Wagner. Mrs. Wagner, aye. Mr. Barr. Mr. Barr, aye. Mr. Rothfuss. Mr. Rothfuss, aye. Mr. Messer. Mr. Messer, aye. Mr. Tipton. Mr. Tipton, aye. Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams, aye. Mr. Poliquin. Mr. Poliquin, aye. Mrs. Love. Mrs. Love, aye. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, aye. Mr. Emmer. Mr. Emmer, aye. Mr. Zeldin. Mr. Zeldin, aye. Mr. Trott. Mr. Trott, aye. Mr. Loudermilk. Mr. Loudermilk, aye. Mr. Mooney. Mr. Mooney, aye. Mr. MacArthur. Mr. MacArthur, aye. Mr. Davidson. Mr. Davidson, aye. Mr. Budd. Mr. Budd, aye. Mr. Kustoff. Mr. Kustoff, aye. Mrs. Tenney. Ms. Tenney, aye. Mr. Hollingsworth. Mr. Hollingsworth, aye. Ms. Waters. Ms. Waters. Ms. Waters, no. Mrs. Maloney. Mrs. Maloney, no. Ms. Velasquez. Mr. Sherman. Mr. Sherman, no. Mr. Meeks. Meeks, pass. Mr. Capuano. Mr. Capuano, no. Mr. Clay. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Lynch, no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, no. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver, no. Ms. Moore. Ms. Moore, no. Mr. Ellison. Mr. Ellison, no. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Himes. Mr. Himes, no. Mr. Foster. Mr. Foster, no. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, no. Mr. Delaney. Mr. Delaney, aye. Ms. Cinema. Ms. Cinema, aye. Mrs. Beatty. Mrs. Beatty, no. Mr. Heck. Mr. Heck, aye. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Vargas, no. Mr. Gottheimer. Mr. Gottheimer, no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, no. Mr. Christ. Mr. Christ, no. Mr. Kewen. Mr. Kewen, no. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Chairman, aye.
Is there any member who has not voted? Well, gentleman from New York.
Mr. Meeks, you are not recorded. Mr. Meeks, no.
Is there any member, any other gentlelady from New York?
Ms. Velasquez. Ms. Velasquez, no.
Is there any other member who has not voted? Is there any member who wishes to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, the ayes are 37 and the nays are 23.
The majority having voted in favor of the bill as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff is authorized to make technical or conforming changes, and members will have 2 days to file views on the reported measure. If members would pause for a moment, I ask unanimous consent to speak out of order. Where's Angela? Angela's over there. Many of you may not recognize Angela Gambeau, our administrative assistant, because she, wave, you gotta wave, you gotta wave. Her work at this committee is done behind the scenes, but I assure you this committee literally could not work without her. And today, a little late, a few weeks late, I want to pause and honor her for 40 years of tireless and commendable service. I'll note I'm surely not going to make it 40 years. But on behalf of all members and staff alike who have worked with Angela, I want to thank her for her outstanding career. Angela Santoro Gambeau began her Hill career back in 1977. She began as a staffer in the personal office of Congressman Chalmers Wiley of Ohio, who served as the ranking member of what was then the Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee. And when Congressman Wiley retired in 1992, Angela began her service with the committee and has been with us ever since. On her watch, the committee has been renovated, its name has been changed, its jurisdiction has been expanded, and she has outlasted 6 chairmen, 4 ranking members, and dozens of staffers. While many things have changed, Angela's steadfast service has not. Not only does she keep the trains running on time, she goes above and beyond to support our team. She never misses a birthday, a holiday, or an opportunity to recognize a fellow staffer for something going on in his or her personal life. One of my staffers has described Angela as the den mother of the Financial Services Committee. Her professionalism is only exceeded by her thoughtful consideration of others, and to say her service has been exceptional is an understatement. Her selfless dedication to her job is outmatched only by her dedication to her family. Husband Nicola and daughter Teresa, who happens to be continuing Angela's legacy by working across the hall at the House Energy and Commerce Committee. Again, it's for all these reasons. As chairman, with a grateful heart, I recognize Angela again and congratulate her on 40 years of service to the United States House of Representatives. Thank you. Now back to business. I now call up H.R. 2219. The clerk will designate the bill by title.
H.R. 2219 to increase the role of the financial industry in combating human trafficking.
The question is now on reporting the bill as amended favorably to the House. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. McHenry. Aye. Mr. McHenry, aye. Mr. King. Aye. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Royce. Aye. Mr. Royce, aye. Mr. Lucas. Aye. Mr. Lucas, aye. Mr. Pierce. Mr. Pierce, aye. Mr. Posey. Mr. Posey, aye. Mr. Lukemeyer. Mr. Lukemeyer, aye. Mr. Huizenga. Mr. Huizenga, aye. Mr. Duffy. Mr. Duffy, aye. Mr. Stivers. Mr. Stivers, aye. Mr. Hulkren. Mr. Hulkren, aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, aye. Mr. Pittenger. Mr. Pittenger, aye. Mrs. Wagner. Mrs. Wagner, aye. Mr. Barr. Mr. Barr, aye. Mr. Rothfuss. Mr. Rothfuss, aye. Mr. Messer. Mr. Messer, aye. Mr. Tipton. Mr. Tipton, aye. Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams, aye. Mr. Poliquin. Mr. Poliquin, aye. Mrs. Love. Mrs. Love, aye. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, aye. Mr. Emmer. Mr. Emmer, aye. Mr. Zeldin. Mr. Zeldin, aye. Mr. Trott. Mr. Trott, aye. Mr. Loudermilk. Mr. Loudermilk, aye. Mr. Mooney. Mr. Mooney, aye. Mr. MacArthur. Mr. MacArthur, aye. Mr. Davidson. Mr. Davidson, aye. Mr. Budd. Mr. Budd, aye. Mr. Kustoff. Mr. Kustoff, aye. Ms. Tenney. Ms. Tenney, aye. Mr. Hollingsworth. Mr. Hollingsworth, aye. Ms. Waters.
No.
Ms. Waters, no. Mrs. Maloney. Ms. Waters, aye. Mrs. Maloney. Mrs. Maloney, aye. Ms. Vasquez. Ms. Vasquez, aye. Mr. Sherman. Mr. Sherman, aye. Mr. Meeks. Mr. Meeks, aye. Mr. Capuano. Mr. Capuano, aye. Mr. Clay. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Lynch, aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, aye. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver, aye. Ms. Moore. Ms. Moore, aye. Mr. Ellison. Mr. Ellison, aye. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Himes. Mr. Himes, aye. Mr. Foster. Mr. Foster, aye. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, aye. Mr. Delaney. Mr. Delaney, aye. Ms. Cinema. Ms. Cinema, aye. Mrs. Beatty. Mrs. Beatty, aye. Mr. Heck. Mr. Heck, aye. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Vargas, aye. Mr. Gottheimer. Mr. Gottheimer, aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, aye. Mr. Christ. Mr. Christ, aye. Mr. Kewen. Mr. Kewen, aye. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Chairman, aye.
Is there any member who has not voted?
Mr. Chairman, I want to make sure.
How's the ranking member recorded?
Ms. Waters, you're recorded as aye.
Thank you.
Is there any member who has not voted? Is there any member who wishes to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, the ayes are 59 and the nays are 0.
Majority having voted in favor of the bill as amended, the bill as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff are authorized to make technical or conforming changes, and members will have 2 days to file views on the reported measure. I now call up H.R. 4546. The clerk will designate the bill by title.
H.R. 4546 to amend the Securities Act of 1933 to specify when a nationally traded security is exempt from state regulation of security offerings.
The question is now on reporting the bill favorably to the House. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. McHenry. Mr. McHenry, aye. Mr. King. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Royce. Mr. Royce, aye. Mr. Lucas. Mr. Lucas, aye. Mr. Pierce. Mr. Pierce, aye. Mr. Posey. Mr. Posey, aye. Mr. Lukemeyer. Mr. Lukemeyer, aye. Mr. Huizenga. Mr. Huizenga, aye. Mr. Duffy. Mr. Duffy. Mr. Duffy, aye. Mr. Stivers. Mr. Stivers, aye. Mr. Hulkren. Mr. Hulkren, aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, aye. Mr. Pittenger. Mr. Pittenger, aye. Mrs. Wagner. Mrs. Wagner, aye. Mr. Barr. Mr. Barr, aye. Mr. Rothfuss. Mr. Rothfuss, aye. Mr. Messer. Mr. Messer, aye. Mr. Tipton. Mr. Tipton, aye. Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams, aye. Mr. Poliquin. Mr. Poliquin, aye. Mrs. Love. Mrs. Love, aye. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, aye. Mr. Emmer. Mr. Emmer, aye. Mr. Zeldin. Mr. Zeldin, aye. Mr. Trott. Mr. Trott, aye. Mr. Loudermilk. Mr. Loudermilk, aye. Mr. Mooney. Mr. Mooney, aye. Mr. MacArthur. Mr. MacArthur, aye. Mr. Davidson. Mr. Davidson, aye. Mr. Budd. Mr. Budd, aye. Mr. Kustoff. Mr. Kustoff, aye. Ms. Tenney. Ms. Tenney, aye. Mr. Hollingsworth. Mr. Hollingsworth, aye. Ms. Waters. Ms. Waters, no. Mrs. Maloney. Mrs. Maloney, aye. Ms. Velasquez. Ms. Velasquez, no. Mr. Sherman. Mr. Sherman, aye. Mr. Meeks. Mr. Meeks, aye. Mr. Capuano. Mr. Capuano, no. Mr. Clay. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Lynch, no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, aye. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver, aye. Ms. Moore. Ms. Moore, no. Mr. Ellison. Ellison, pass. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Himes. Mr. Himes, aye. Mr. Foster. Mr. Foster, aye. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, no. Mr. Delaney. Mr. Delaney, aye. Ms. Cinema. Ms. Cinema, aye. Mrs. Beatty. Mrs. Beatty, no. Mr. Heck. Mr. Heck, aye. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Vargas, aye. Mr. Gottheimer. Mr. Gottheimer, aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, no. Mr. Christ. Mr. Christ, no. Mr. Kewen. Mr. Kewen, aye. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Chairman, aye.
Is there any member who has not voted? Gentleman from Minnesota.
Mr. Ellison, no.
Gentleman from Missouri.
Mr. Clay. Mr. Clay, no.
Is there any other member who has not voted? Gentleman from Missouri. Okay. First, is there any other member who has not voted? Any member wishes to change his or her vote? Gentleman from Missouri.
Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver's no, now.
Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Green is now no.
Any other member wishes to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, the ayes are 46 and the nays are 14.
A majority having voted in favor of the bill is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff are authorized to make technical or conforming changes. Members will have 2 days to file views on the reported measure. I now call up H.R. 4519. The clerk will designate the bill by title.
H.R. 4519 to amend the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 to repeal certain disclosure requirements related to resource extraction and for other purposes.
The question is now on reporting the bill favorably to the House. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. McHenry. Aye. Mr. McHenry, aye. Mr. King. Aye. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Royce. Mr. Royce, no. Mr. Lucas. Mr. Lucas, aye. Mr. Pierce. Mr. Pierce, aye. Mr. Posey. Mr. Posey, aye. Mr. Lukemeyer. Mr. Lukemeyer, aye. Mr. Huizenga. Mr. Huizenga, aye. Mr. Duffy. Mr. Duffy, aye. Mr. Stivers. Mr. Stivers, aye. Mr. Hulkren. Mr. Hulkren, aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, aye. Mr. Pittenger. Mr. Pittenger, aye. Mrs. Wagner. Mrs. Wagner, aye. Mr. Barr. Mr. Barr, aye. Mr. Rothfuss. Mr. Rothfuss, aye. Mr. Messer. Mr. Messer, aye. Mr. Tipton. Mr. Tipton, aye. Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams, aye. Mr. Poliquin. Mr. Poliquin, aye. Mrs. Love. Mrs. Love, aye. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, aye. Mr. Emmer. Mr. Emmer, aye. Mr. Zeldin. Mr. Zeldin, aye. Mr. Trott. Mr. Trott, aye. Mr. Loudermilk. Mr. Loudermilk, aye. Mr. Mooney. Mr. Mooney, aye. Mr. MacArthur. Mr. MacArthur, aye. Mr. Davidson. Mr. Davidson, aye. Mr. Budd. Mr. Budd, aye. Mr. Kustoff. Mr. Kustoff, aye. Ms. Tenney. Ms. Tenney, aye. Mr. Hollingsworth. Mr. Hollingsworth, aye. Ms. Waters.
No.
Ms. Waters, no. Mrs. Maloney. No. Mrs. Maloney, no. Ms. Velasquez. No. Ms. Velasquez, no. Mr. Sherman. No. Mr. Sherman, no. Mr. Meeks. No. Mr. Meeks, no. Mr. Capuano. No. Mr. Capuano, no. Mr. Clay. No. Mr. Clay, no. Mr. Lynch. No. Mr. Lynch, no. Mr. Scott. No. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Green? Mr. Green, no. Mr. Cleaver? Mr. Cleaver, no. Ms. Moore? Ms. Moore, no. Mr. Ellison? Mr. Ellison, no. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Himes? Mr. Himes, no. Mr. Foster? Mr. Foster, no. Mr. Kildee? Mr. Kildee, no. Mr. Delaney? Mr. Delaney, no. Ms. Cinema? Ms. Cinema, no. Mrs. Beatty? Mrs. Beatty, no. Mr. Heck? Mr. Heck, no. Mr. Vargas? Mr. Vargas, no. Mr. Gottheimer? Mr. Gottheimer, no. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Gonzalez, no. Mr. Chris? Mr. Chris, no. Mr. Kewen? Mr. Kewen, no. Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Chairman, aye.
Is there any member who has not voted? Is there any member who wishes to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will report, if she can. I know.
Mr. Chairman, the ayes are 33 and the nays are 27.
Majority having voted in favor of the bill is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff are authorized to make technical or conforming changes, and members will have 2 days to file views on the reported measure. I now call up H.R. 4529. The clerk will designate the bill by title.
H.R. 4529, to direct the Securities and Exchange Commission to revise Section Form S3 as to add listing and registration of a class of common equity securities in a national securities exchange as an additional basis for satisfying the requirements of General Instruction IB1 of such form, and to remove such listings and registrations as a requirement of General Instructions IB6 of such form.
Mr. McHenry.
Aye.
Mr. King. Aye. Mr. Royce. Royce, aye. Mr. Lucas. Aye. Lucas, aye. Mr. Pierce. Pierce, aye. Mr. Posey. Mr. Posey, aye. Mr. Lukemeyer. Mr. Lukemeyer, aye. Mr. Huizinga. Mr. Huizinga, aye. Mr. Duffy. Mr. Duffy, aye. Mr. Stivers. Mr. Stivers, aye. Mr. Holkern. Mr. Holkern, aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, aye. Mr. Pittenger. Mr. Pittenger, aye. Ms. Wagner. Mrs. Wagner, aye. Mr. Barr. Mr. Barr, aye. Mr. Rothfuss. Mr. Rothfuss, aye. Mr. Messer. Mr. Messer, aye. Mr. Tipton. Mr. Tipton, aye. Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams, aye. Mr. Poliquin. Mr. Poliquin, aye. Mrs. Love. Mrs. Love, aye. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, aye. Mr. Emmer. Mr. Emmer, aye. Mr. Zeldin. Mr. Zeldin, aye. Mr. Trott. Mr. Trott, aye. Mr. Loudermilk. Mr. Loudermilk, aye. Mr. Mooney. Mr. Mooney, aye. Mr. MacArthur. Mr. MacArthur, aye. Mr. Davidson. Mr. Davidson, aye. Mr. Budd. Mr. Budd, aye. Mr. Kustoff. Mr. Kustoff, aye. Ms. Tenney. Ms. Tenney, aye. Mr. Hollingsworth. Aye. Mr. Hollingsworth, aye. Ms. Waters. Ms. Waters, no. Ms. Maloney. Mrs. Maloney, no. Mrs. Velasquez. Mrs. Velasquez, no. Mr. Sherman. Mr. Sherman, no. Mr. Meeks. Mr. Meeks, no. Mr. Capuano. Mr. Capuano, no. Mr. Clay. Mr. Clay, no. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Lynch, no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, no. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver, no. Ms. Moore. Ms. Moore, no. Mr. Ellison. Mr. Ellison, no. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Himes. Mr. Himes, no. Mr. Foster. Mr. Foster, no. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, no. Mr. Delaney. Mr. Delaney, no. Ms. Cinema. Ms. Cinema, no. Ms. Beatty. Mrs. Beatty, no. Mr. Heck. Mr. Heck, no. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Vargas, no. Mr. Gottheimer. Mr. Gottheimer, no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, no. Mr. Christ. Mr. Christ, no. Mr. Kewen. Mr. Kewen, no. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Is there any member who has not voted? Is there any member who wishes to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will report.
The ayes are 34 and the nays are 26.
Majority having voted in favor of the bill is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff are authorized to make technical or conforming changes, and members have 2 days to file views on the reported measure. I now call up H.R. 1457. The clerk will designate the bill by title.
To establish requirements for the use of a driver's license or personal identification cards by certain financial institutions for opening an account or obtaining a financial product or service and for other purposes.
Question is now on reporting the bill as amended favorably to the House. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. McHenry. Aye. Mr. McHenry, aye. Mr. King. Aye. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Royce. Aye. Mr. Lucas. Aye. Mr. Lucas, aye. Mr. Pierce. Mr. Pierce, aye. Mr. Posey. Mr. Posey, aye. Mr. Lukemeyer. Mr. Lukemeyer, aye. Mr. Huizinga. Aye. Mr. Huizinga, aye. Mr. Duffy. Aye. Mr. Duffy, aye. Mr. Stivers. Aye. Mr. Stivers, aye. Mr. Holkren. Mr. Holkren, aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, aye. Mr. Pittenger. Mr. Pittenger, aye. Mrs. Wagner. Mrs. Wagner, aye. Mr. Barr. Mr. Barr, aye. Mr. Rothfuss. Mr. Rothfuss, aye. Mr. Messer. Mr. Messer, aye. Mr. Tipton. Mr. Tipton, aye. Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams, aye. Mr. Poliquin. Mr. Poliquin, aye. Mrs. Love. Mrs. Love, aye. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, aye. Mr. Emmer. Mr. Hemmer, aye. Mr. Zeldin. Mr. Zeldin, aye. Mr. Trott. Mr. Trott, aye. Mr. Loudermilk. Mr. Loudermilk, aye. Mr. Mooney. Mr. Mooney, aye. Mr. MacArthur. Mr. MacArthur, aye. Mr. Davidson. Mr. Davidson, aye. Mr. Budd. Mr. Budd, aye. Mr. Kustoff. Mr. Kustoff, aye. Miss Tenney. Miss Tenney, aye. Mr. Hollingsworth. Mr. Hollingsworth, aye. Miss Waters. Aye. Miss Waters, aye. Miss Maloney. Mrs. Maloney. Aye. Mrs. Maloney, aye. Mr. Velasquez. Ms. Velasquez, aye. Mr. Sherman. Mr. Sherman, aye. Mr. Meeks. Mr. Meeks, aye. Mr. Capuano. Mr. Capuano, aye. Mr. Clay. Mr. Clay, aye. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Lynch, aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, aye. Mr. Green, sorry, Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver, aye. Ms. Moore. Ms. Moore, aye. Mr. Ellison. Mr. Ellison, aye. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Himes. Mr. Himes, aye. Mr. Foster. Mr. Foster, aye. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, aye. Ms. Delaney. Mr. Delaney, aye. Ms. Cinema. Ms. Cinema, aye. Ms. Beatty. Mrs. Beatty, aye. Mr. Heck. Mr. Heck, aye. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Vargas, aye. Mr. Gottheimer. Mr. Gottheimer, aye. Ms. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, aye. Mr. Christ. Mr. Christ, aye. Mr. Kewen. Mr. Kewen, aye. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Is there any member has not voted? Gentleman from California. Is there any other member has not voted? Is there any member who wishes to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will report.
The ayes are 60, the nays are 0.
Majority having voted in favor of the bill as amended, is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff are authorized to make technical or conforming changes, and members will have 2 days to file views on the reported measure. I now call up H.R. 4545. The clerk will designate the bill by title.
H.R. 4545 to amend the Federal Financial Institution Examination Council Act of 1978 to improve the examination of depository institutions and for other purposes.
The question now occurs on agreeing to the amendment offered by the gentle lady from California on which a recorded vote was ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. McHenry. No. Mr. McHenry, no. Mr. King. No. Mr. King, no. Mr. Royce. No. Mr. Royce, no. Mr. Lucas. No. Mr. Lucas, no. Mr. Pierce. Mr. Pierce, no. Mr. Posey. Mr. Posey, no. Mr. Lukemeyer. Mr. Lukemeyer, no. Mr. Huizinga. Mr. Huizinga, no. Mr. Duffy. No. Mr. Duffy, no. Mr. Stivers. Mr. Stivers, no. Mr. Holkren. Mr. Holkren, no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, no. Mr. Pittenger. Mr. Pittenger, no. Mrs. Wagner. Mrs. Wagner, no. Mr. Barr. Mr. Barr, no. Mr. Rothfuss. Mr. Rothfuss, no. Mr. Messer. Mr. Messer, no. Mr. Tipton. Mr. Tipton, no. Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams, no. Mr. Poliquin. Mr. Poliquin, no. Mrs. Love. Mrs. Love, no. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, no. Mr. Emmer. Mr. Emmer. Mr. Emmer, no. Mr. Zeldin. Mr. Zeldin, no. Mr. Trott. Mr. Trott, no. Mr. Loudermilk. Mr. Loudermilk, no. Mr. Mooney. Mr. Mooney, no. Mr. MacArthur. Mr. MacArthur, no. Mr. Davidson. Mr. Davidson, no. Mr. Budd. Mr. Budd, no. Mr. Kustoff. Mr. Kustoff, no. Ms. Tenney. Ms. Tenney, no. Mr. Hollingsworth. Mr. Hollingsworth, no. Ms. Waters.
Aye.
Ms. Waters, aye. Mrs. Maloney. Aye. Mrs. Maloney, aye. Ms. Velasquez. Aye. Ms. Velasquez, aye. Mr. Sherman. Aye. Mr. Sherman, aye. Mr. Meeks. Aye. Mr. Meeks, aye. Mr. Capuano. Aye. Mr. Capuano, aye. Mr. Clay. Mr. Clay, aye. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Lynch, aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, aye. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver, aye. Ms. Moore. Ms. Moore, aye. Mr. Ellison. Mr. Ellison, aye. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Himes. Mr. Himes, aye. Mr. Foster. Mr. Foster, aye. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, aye. Mr. Delaney. Mr. Delaney, aye. Ms. Cinema. Ms. Cinema, aye. Mrs. Beatty. Mrs. Beatty, aye. Mr. Heck. Mr. Heck, aye. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Vargas, aye. Mr. Gottheimer. Mr. Gottheimer, aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, aye. Mr. Christ. Mr. Christ, aye. Mr. Kewen. Mr. Kewen, aye. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Chairman, no.
Is there any member who has not voted? Is there any member who wishes to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, the ayes are 26 and the nays are 34.
The amendment then is not agreed to. The question now occurs on reporting the bill favorably to the House. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition? Is he requesting a recorded vote?
I request a recorded vote.
All those in favor of a recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. Sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. McHenry. Mr. McHenry, aye. Mr. King. Mr. King. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Royce. Mr. Royce, aye. Mr. Lucas. Mr. Lucas, aye. Mr. Pierce. Mr. Pierce, aye. Mr. Posey. Mr. Posey, aye. Mr. Lukemeyer. Mr. Lukemeyer, aye. Mr. Huizinga. Mr. Huizinga, aye. Mr. Duffy. Mr. Duffy, aye. Mr. Stivers. Mr. Stivers, aye. Mr. Holcren. Mr. Holcren, aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, aye. Mr. Pittenger. Mr. Pittenger, aye. Mrs. Wagner. Mrs. Wagner, aye. Mr. Barr. Mr. Barr, aye. Mr. Rothfuss. Mr. Rothfuss, aye. Mr. Messer.
The clerk will suspend. Committee will come to order so the clerk can hear the votes. The clerk will proceed.
Mr. Messer. Mr. Messer, aye. Mr. Tipton. Mr. Tipton, aye. Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams, aye. Mr. Poliquin. Mr. Poliquin, aye. Mrs. Love. Mrs. Love, aye. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, aye. Mr. Emmer. Mr. Emmer, aye. Mr. Zeldin. Mr. Zeldin, aye. Mr. Trott. Mr. Trott, aye. Mr. Loudermilk. Mr. Loudermilk, aye. Mr. Mooney. Mr. Mooney, aye. Mr. MacArthur. Mr. MacArthur, aye. Mr. Davidson. Mr. Davidson, aye. Mr. Budd. Mr. Budd, aye. Mr. Kustoff. Mr. Kustoff, aye. Ms. Tenney. Ms. Tenney, aye. Mr. Hollingsworth. Mr. Hollingsworth, aye. Ms. Waters. Ms. Waters, no. Mrs. Maloney. Mrs. Maloney, aye. Ms. Velasquez. Ms. Velasquez, no. Mr. Sherman. Mr. Sherman, aye. Mr. Meeks. Mr. Meeks, aye. Mr. Capuano. Mr. Capuano, no. Mr. Clay. Mr. Clay, no. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Lynch, no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, no. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver, no. Ms. Moore. Ms. Moore, aye. Mr. Ellison. Mr. Ellison, aye. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Himes. Mr. Himes, aye. Mr. Foster. Mr. Foster, aye. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, no. Mr. Delaney. Mr. Delaney, aye. Ms. Cinema. Ms. Cinema, aye. Mrs. Beatty. Mrs. Beatty, no. Mr. Heck. Mr. Heck, aye. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Vargas, aye. Mr. Gottheimer. Mr. Gottheimer, aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, aye. Mr. Christ. Mr. Christ, aye. Mr. Kewen. Mr. Kewen, aye. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Chairman, aye.
Is there any member who has not voted? Is there any member who wishes to change his or her vote? Gentleman from Minnesota.
Ellison is off, aye, on no.
Is there any other member who wishes to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, the ayes are 50 and the nays are 10.
Majority having voted in favor of the bill is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff are authorized to make technical or conforming changes, and members will have 2 days to file views on the reported measure. Now call up H.R. 435. The clerk will designate the bill by title.
H.R. 435, to amend the Fair Credit Reporting Act to clarify federal law with respect to reporting certain positive consumer credit information to consumer reporting agencies and for other purposes.
The question is now on reporting the bill as amended favorably to the House. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. McHenry. Mr. McHenry, aye. Mr. King. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Royce. Mr. Royce, aye. Mr. Lucas. Mr. Lucas, aye. Mr. Pierce. Mr. Pierce, aye. Mr. Posey. Mr. Posey, aye. Mr. Lukemeyer. Mr. Lukemeyer, aye. Mr. Huizenga. Mr. Huizenga, aye. Mr. Duffy. Mr. Duffy. Mr. Duffy, aye. Mr. Stivers. Mr. Stivers, aye. Mr. Holgren. Mr. Holgren, aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, aye. Mr. Pittenger. Mr. Pittenger, aye. Mrs. Wagner. Mrs. Wagner. Mrs. Wagner, aye. Mr. Barr. Mr. Barr, aye. Mr. Rothfuss. Mr. Rothfuss, aye. Mr. Messer. Mr. Messer, aye. Mr. Tipton. Mr. Tipton, aye. Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams, aye. Mr. Poliquin. Mr. Poliquin, aye. Mrs. Love. Mrs. Love, aye. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, aye. Mr. Emmer. Mr. Emmer, aye. Mr. Zeldin. Mr. Zeldin, aye. Mr. Trott. Mr. Trott, aye. Mr. Loudermilk. Mr. Loudermilk, aye. Mr. Mooney. Mr. Mooney, aye. Mr. MacArthur. Mr. MacArthur, aye. Mr. Davidson. Mr. Budd. Mr. Budd, aye. Mr. Kustoff. Mr. Kustoff, aye. Ms. Tenney. Ms. Tenney, aye. Mr. Hollingsworth. Mr. Hollingsworth, aye. Ms. Waters. Ms. Waters, aye. Mrs. Maloney. Mrs. Maloney, aye. Ms. Velasquez. Ms. Velasquez, aye. Mr. Sherman. Mr. Sherman, aye. Mr. Meeks. Mr. Meeks, aye. Mr. Capuano. Mr. Capuano, aye. Mr. Clay. Mr. Clay, aye. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Lynch, aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, aye. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver, aye. Ms. Moore. Ms. Moore, aye. Mr. Ellison. Mr. Ellison, aye. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Himes. Mr. Himes, aye. Mr. Foster. Mr. Foster, aye. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, aye. Mr. Delaney. Mr. Delaney, aye. Ms. Cinema. Ms. Cinema, aye. Mrs. Beatty. Mrs. Beatty, aye. Mr. Heck. Mr. Heck, aye. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Vargas, aye. Mr. Gottheimer. Mr. Gottheimer, aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, aye. Mr. Christ. Mr. Christ, aye. Mr. Kewen. Mr. Kewen, aye. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Chairman, aye.
Is there any member who has not voted? Gentleman from Ohio.
Mr. Davidson, aye.
Is there any other member who has not voted? Is there any member who wishes to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, the ayes are 60 and the nays are 0.
Majority having voted in favor of the bill as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff are authorized to make technical or conforming changes, and members will have 2 days to file views on the reported measure. I now call up H.R. 2948. The clerk will designate the bill by title.
H.R. 2948 to amend the Safe Mortgage Licensing Act of 2008 to provide a temporary license for loan originators transitioning between employers and for other purposes.
Question is now on reporting the bill favorably to the House. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. McHenry. Aye. Mr. McHenry, aye. Mr. King. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Royce. Mr. Royce, aye. Mr. Lucas. Mr. Lucas, aye. Mr. Pierce. Mr. Pierce, aye. Mr. Posey. Mr. Posey, aye. Mr. Lukemeyer. Mr. Lukemeyer, aye. Mr. Huizenga. Mr. Huizenga, aye. Mr. Duffy. Mr. Duffy, aye. Mr. Stivers. Mr. Stivers, aye. Mr. Holgren. Mr. Holgren, aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, aye. Mr. Pittenger. Mr. Pittenger, aye. Mrs. Wagner. Mrs. Wagner, aye. Mr. Barr. Mr. Barr. Mr. Barr, aye. Mr. Rothfuss. Mr. Rothfuss, aye. Mr. Messer. Mr. Messer, aye. Mr. Tipton. Mr. Tipton, aye. Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams, aye. Mr. Poliquin. Mr. Poliquin, aye. Mrs. Love. Mrs. Love, aye. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, aye. Mr. Emmer. Mr. Emmer, aye. Mr. Zeldin. Mr. Zeldin, aye. Mr. Trott. Mr. Trott, aye. Mr. Loudermilk. Mr. Loudermilk, aye. Mr. Mooney. Mr. Mooney, aye. Mr. MacArthur. Mr. MacArthur, aye. Mr. Davidson. Mr. Davidson, aye. Mr. Budd. Mr. Budd, aye. Mr. Kustoff. Mr. Kustoff, aye. Ms. Tenney. Ms. Tenney, aye. Mr. Hollingsworth. Mr. Hollingsworth, aye. Ms. Waters. Ms. Waters, aye. Mrs. Maloney. Mrs. Maloney, aye. Ms. Vasquez. Ms. Vasquez, aye. Mr. Sherman. Mr. Sherman, aye. Mr. Meeks. Mr. Meeks, aye. Mr. Capuano. Mr. Capuano, aye. Mr. Clay. Mr. Clay, aye. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Lynch, aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, aye. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver, aye. Ms. Moore. Ms. Moore, aye. Mr. Ellison. Mr. Ellison, aye. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Himes. Mr. Himes, aye. Mr. Foster. Mr. Foster, aye. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, aye. Mr. Delaney. Mr. Delaney, aye. Ms. Cinema. Ms. Cinema, aye. Mrs. Beatty. Mrs. Beatty, aye. Mr. Heck. Mr. Heck, aye. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Vargas, aye. Mr. Gottheimer. Mr. Gottheimer, aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, aye. Mr. Christ. Mr. Christ, aye. Mr. Kewen. Mr. Kewen, aye. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Chairman, aye.
Is there any member has not voted? Is there any member wish to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, the ayes are 60 and the nays are 0.
Majority having voted in favor of the bill is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff are authorized to make technical or conforming changes, and members will have 2 days to file views on the reported measure. I now call up H.R. 3179. The clerk will designate the bill by title.
H.R. 3179 to require the appropriate federal banking agencies when issuing certain prudential regulations that are substantially more stringent than a corresponding international prudent standard to publish the rationale for doing so and cost-benefit analysis of the differences and for other purposes.
Question is now on reporting the bill favorably to the House. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. McHenry. Mr. McHenry, aye. Mr. King. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Royce. Mr. Royce, aye. Mr. Lucas. Mr. Lucas, aye. Mr. Pierce. Mr. Pierce, aye. Mr. Posey. Mr. Posey, aye. Mr. Lukemeyer. Mr. Lukemeyer, aye. Mr. Huizenga. Mr. Huizenga, aye. Mr. Duffy. Mr. Duffy, aye. Mr. Stivers. Mr. Stivers, aye. Mr. Holgren. Mr. Holgren, aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, aye. Mr. Pittenger. Mr. Pittenger, aye. Mrs. Wagner. Mrs. Wagner, aye. Mr. Barr. Mr. Barr, aye. Mr. Rothfuss. Mr. Rothfuss, aye. Mr. Messer. Mr. Messer, aye. Mr. Tipton. Mr. Tipton, aye. Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams, aye. Mr. Poliquin. Mr. Poliquin, aye. Mrs. Love. Mrs. Love, aye. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, aye. Mr. Emmer. Mr. Emmer, aye. Mr. Zeldin. Mr. Zeldin, aye. Mr. Trott. Mr. Trott, aye. Mr. Loudermilk. Mr. Loudermilk, aye. Mr. Mooney. Mr. Mooney, aye. Mr. MacArthur. Mr. MacArthur, aye. Mr. Davidson. Mr. Davidson, aye. Mr. Budd. Mr. Budd, aye. Mr. Kustoff. Mr. Kustoff, aye. Ms. Tenney. Ms. Tenney, aye. Mr. Hollingsworth. Mr. Hollingsworth, aye. Ms. Waters. Ms. Waters, no. Mrs. Maloney. Mrs. Maloney, no. Ms. Vasquez. Ms. Vasquez, no. Mr. Sherman. Mr. Sherman, no. Mr. Meeks. Mr. Meeks, no. Mr. Capuano. Mr. Capuano, no. Mr. Clay. Mr. Clay, no. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Lynch, no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, no. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver, no. Ms. Moore. Ms. Moore, no. Mr. Ellison. Mr. Ellison, no. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Himes. Mr. Himes, no. Mr. Foster. Mr. Foster, no. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, no. Mr. Delaney. Mr. Delaney, no. Ms. Cinema. Ms. Cinema, no. Mrs. Beatty. Mrs. Beatty, no. Mr. Heck. Mr. Heck, no. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Vargas, no. Mr. Gottheimer. Mr. Gottheimer, no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, no. Mr. Christ. Mr. Christ, no. Mr. Kewen. Mr. Kewen, no. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Chairman, aye.
Is there any member has not voted? Any member wishes to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, the ayes are 34 and the nays are 26.
Majority having voted in favor of the bill is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff are authorized to make technical or conforming changes, and members will have 2 days to file views on the reported measure. I now call up H.R. 4464. The clerk will designate the bill by title.
H.R. 4464 to repeal the rule issued by the National Credit Union Administration entitled Risk-Based Capital.
The question now occurs on agreeing to the amendment offered by the ranking member, the gentlelady from California, on which a recorded vote was ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. McHenry?
No.
Mr. McHenry, no. Mr. King? No. Mr. King, no. Mr. Royce? Mr. Royce, no. Mr. Lucas? Mr. Lucas, no. Mr. Pierce? Mr. Pierce, no. Mr. Posey? Mr. Posey, no. Mr. Lukemeyer? Mr. Lukemeyer, no. Mr. Huizenga? Mr. Huizenga, no. Mr. Duffy? Mr. Duffy, no. Mr. Stivers? Mr. Stivers, no. Mr. Holcren? Mr. Holcren, no. Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross, no. Mr. Pittenger? Mrs. Wagner? Mrs. Wagner, no. Mr. Barr? Mr. Barr, no. Mr. Rothfuss? Mr. Rothfuss, no. Mr. Messer? Mr. Messer, no. Mr. Tipton? Mr. Tipton, no. Mr. Williams? Mr. Williams, no. Mr. Poliquin? Mr. Poliquin, no. Mrs. Love? Mrs. Love, no. Mr. Hill? Mr. Hill, no. Mr. Emmer? Mr. Emmer, no. Mr. Zeldin? Mr. Zeldin, no. Mr. Trott? Mr. Trott, no. Mr. Loudermilk? Mr. Loudermilk, no. Mr. Mooney? Mr. Mooney, no. Mr. MacArthur? Mr. MacArthur, no. Mr. Davidson? Mr. Davidson, no. Mr. Budd? Mr. Kustoff? No. Mr. Kustoff, no. Ms. Tenney? Ms. Tenney, no. Mr. Hollingsworth? Mr. Hollingsworth, no. Ms. Waters? Ms. Waters, aye. Mrs. Maloney? Mrs. Maloney, aye. Ms. Velasquez? Ms. Velasquez, aye. Mr. Sherman? Mr. Sherman, aye. Mr. Meeks? Mr. Meeks? Mr. Meeks, aye. Mr. Capuano? Mr. Capuano, aye. Mr. Clay? Mr. Clay, aye. Mr. Lynch? Mr. Lynch, aye. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Green? Mr. Green, aye. Mr. Cleaver? Mr. Cleaver, aye. Ms. Moore? Ms. Moore, aye. Mr. Ellison? Mr. Ellison? Mr. Ellison, aye. Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Himes? Mr. Himes, aye. Mr. Foster? Mr. Foster, aye. Mr. Kildee? Mr. Kildee, aye. Mr. Delaney? Mr. Delaney, aye. Ms. Sinema? Ms. Sinema, aye. Mrs. Beatty? Mrs. Beatty, aye. Mr. Heck? Mr. Heck, aye. Mr. Vargas? Mr. Vargas, aye. Mr. Gottheimer? Mr. Gottheimer, no. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Gonzalez, aye. Mr. Chris? Mr. Chris, aye. Mr. Kewen? Mr. Kewen, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Chairman, no.
Is there any member who has not voted? Is there any member who wishes to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, the ayes are 25 and the nays are 33.
The amendment then is not agreed to. The question now occurs on reporting the bill favorably to the House. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. For purposes, gentlemen from Florida seek recognition. Recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. A sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is so ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. McHenry. Mr. McHenry, aye. Mr. King. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Royce. Mr. Royce, aye. Mr. Lucas. Mr. Lucas, aye. Mr. Pierce. Mr. Pierce, aye. Mr. Posey. Mr. Posey, aye. Mr. Lukemeyer. Mr. Lukemeyer, aye. Mr. Huizenga. Mr. Huizenga, aye. Mr. Duffy. Mr. Duffy, aye. Mr. Stivers. Mr. Stivers, aye. Mr. Holcren. Mr. Holcren, aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, aye. Mr. Pittenger. Mrs. Wagner. Mrs. Wagner. Mrs. Wagner, aye. Mr. Barr. Mr. Barr, aye. Mr. Rothfuss. Mr. Rothfuss, aye. Mr. Messer. Mr. Messer, aye. Mr. Tipton. Mr. Tipton, aye. Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams, aye. Mr. Poliquin. Mr. Poliquin, aye. Mrs. Love. Mrs. Love, aye. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, aye. Mr. Emmer. Mr. Emmer, aye. Mr. Zeldin. Mr. Zeldin, aye. Mr. Trott. Mr. Trott, aye. Mr. Loudermilk. Mr. Loudermilk, aye. Mr. Mooney. Mr. Mooney, aye. Mr. MacArthur. Mr. MacArthur, aye. Mr. Davidson. Mr. Davidson, aye. Mr. Budd. Mr. Kustoff. Mr. Kustoff, aye. Ms. Tenney. Ms. Tenney, aye. Mr. Hollingsworth. Mr. Hollingsworth, aye. Ms. Waters. Ms. Waters, no. Ms. Maloney. Ms. Maloney, no. Ms. Velasquez. Ms. Velasquez, no. Mr. Sherman. Mr. Sherman, no. Mr. Meeks. Mr. Meeks, no. Mr. Capuano. Mr. Capuano, no. Mr. Clay. Mr. Clay, no. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Lynch, no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Green. The ranking members recorded no. Mr. Green, no. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver, no. Ms. Moore. Ms. Moore, no. Mr. Ellison. Mr. Ellison, no. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Himes. Mr. Himes, no. Mr. Foster. Mr. Foster, no. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, no. Mr. Delaney. Mr. Delaney, no. Ms. Cinema. Ms. Cinema, no. Mrs. Beatty. Mrs. Beatty, no. Mr. Heck. Mr. Heck, no. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Vargas, no. Mr. Gottheimer. Mr. Gottheimer, no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, no. Mr. Chris. Mr. Chris, no. Mr. Kewen. Mr. Kewen, no. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Chairman, aye.
Is there any member who has not voted? Is there any member who wishes to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, the ayes are 33 and the nays are 25.
Majority having voted in favor of the bill is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff are authorized to make technical or conforming changes, and members have 2 days to file views on the reported measure. I now call up H.R. 4560. The clerk will designate the bill by title.
H.R. 4560 to suspend contributions by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to the Housing Trust Fund during any period that the full required dividend payments under the senior preferred stock purchase agreements for such enterprises are not made and for other purposes.
The question now occurs on agreeing to the amendment offered by the ranking member, the gentlelady from California, on which a recorded vote was ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. McHenry. Mr. McHenry, no. Mr. King. Mr. King. Mr. King, no. Mr. Royce. Mr. Royce, no. Mr. Lucas. Mr. Lucas, no. Mr. Pierce. Mr. Pierce, no. Mr. Posey. Mr. Posey, no. Mr. Lukemeyer. Mr. Lukemeyer, no. Mr. Huizenga. Mr. Huizenga, no. Mr. Duffy. Mr. Duffy, no. Mr. Stivers. Mr. Stivers, no. Mr. Hulkren. Mr. Hulkren, no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, no. Mr. Pittenger. Mr. Pittenger, no. Mrs. Wagner. Mrs. Wagner, no. Mr. Barr. Mr. Barr, no. Mr. Rothfuss. Mr. Rothfuss, no. Mr. Messer. Mr. Messer, no. Mr. Tipton. Mr. Tipton, no. Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams, no. Mr. Poliquin. Mr. Poliquin, no. Mrs. Love. Mrs. Love, no. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, no. Mr. Emmer. Mr. Emmer, no. Mr. Zeldin. Mr. Zeldin, no. Mr. Trott. Mr. Trott, no. Mr. Loudermilk. Mr. Loudermilk, no. Mr. Mooney. Mr. Mooney, no. Mr. MacArthur. Mr. MacArthur, no. Mr. Davidson. Mr. Davidson, no. Mr. Budd. Mr. Budd, no. Mr. Kustoff. Mr. Kustoff, no. Ms. Tenney. Ms. Tenney, no. Mr. Hollingsworth. Mr. Hollingsworth, no. Ms. Waters. Ms. Waters, aye. Mrs. Maloney. Mrs. Maloney, aye. Ms. Velasquez. Ms. Velasquez, aye. Mr. Sherman. Mr. Sherman, no. Mr. Meeks. Mr. Meeks, aye. Mr. Capuano. Mr. Capuano, aye. Mr. Clay. Mr. Clay, aye. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Lynch, aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, no. I'm sorry, Mr. Green, aye. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver, aye. Ms. Moore. Ms. Moore, aye. Mr. Ellison. Mr. Ellison, aye. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Himes. Mr. Himes, aye. Mr. Foster. Mr. Foster, aye. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, aye. Mr. Delaney. Mr. Delaney, aye. Ms. Cinema. Ms. Cinema, aye. Mrs. Beatty. Mrs. Beatty, aye. Mr. Heck. Mr. Heck, aye. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Vargas, aye. Mr. Gottheimer. Mr. Gottheimer, aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, aye. Mr. Chris. Mr. Chris, aye. Mr. Kewen. Mr. Kewen, aye. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Chairman, no.
Is there any member who has not voted? Is there any member who wishes to change his or her vote? Gentleman from California. How's the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, recorded?
Mr. Sherman is recorded as a no. Mr. Sherman off no on aye.
Is there any other member who wishes to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, the ayes are 26 and the nays are 34.
The amendment then is not agreed to. The question now occurs on reporting the bill favorably to the House. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. For what purposes, gentlemen from Arkansas seek recognition?
As for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. Sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is so ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. McHenry. Mr. McHenry, aye. Mr. King. Mr. King. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Royce. Mr. Royce, aye. Mr. Lucas. Mr. Lucas, aye. Mr. Pierce. Mr. Pierce, aye. Mr. Posey. Mr. Posey, aye. Mr. Lukemeyer. Mr. Lukemeyer, aye. Mr. Huizenga. Mr. Huizenga, aye. Mr. Duffy. Mr. Duffy, aye. Mr. Stivers. Mr. Holgren. Mr. Holgren, aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, aye. Mr. Pittenger. Mr. Pittenger. Mr. Pittenger, aye. Mrs. Wagner. Mrs. Wagner, aye. Mr. Barr. Mr. Barr, aye. Mr. Rothfuss. Mr. Rothfuss, aye. Mr. Messer. Mr. Messer, aye. Mr. Tipton. Mr. Tipton, aye. Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams, aye. Mr. Poliquin. Mr. Poliquin, aye. Mrs. Love. Mrs. Love, aye. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, aye. Mr. Emmer. Mr. Emmer, aye. Mr. Zeldin. Mr. Zeldin, aye. Mr. Trott. Mr. Trott, aye. Mr. Loudermilk. Mr. Loudermilk, aye. Mr. Mooney. Mr. Mooney, aye. Mr. MacArthur. No. Mr. MacArthur, no. Mr. Davidson. Mr. Davidson, aye. Mr. Budd. Mr. Budd, aye. Mr. Kustoff. Mr. Kustoff, aye. Ms. Tenney. Ms. Tenney, aye. Mr. Hollingsworth. Mr. Hollingsworth, aye. Ms. Waters. Ms. Waters, no. Mrs. Maloney. Mrs. Maloney, no. Ms. Velasquez. Ms. Velasquez, no. Mr. Sherman. Mr. Sherman, no. Mr. Meeks. Mr. Meeks, no. Mr. Capuano. Mr. Capuano, no. Mr. Clay. Mr. Clay, no. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Lynch, no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, no. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver, no. Ms. Moore. Ms. Moore, no. Mr. Ellison. Mr. Ellison, no. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Himes. Mr. Himes, no. Mr. Foster. Mr. Foster, no. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, no. Mr. Delaney. Mr. Delaney, no. Ms. Cinema. Ms. Cinema, no. Mrs. Beatty. Mrs. Beatty, no. Mr. Heck. Mr. Heck, no. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Vargas, no. Mr. Gottheimer. Mr. Gottheimer, no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, no. Mr. Chris. Mr. Chris, no. Mr. Kewen. Mr. Kewen, no. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Chairman, aye.
Is there any member who has not voted? Gentleman from Ohio.
Mr. Stivers, aye.
Is there any other member who has not voted? Is there any member who wishes to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, the ayes are 33 and the nays are 27.
Majority having voted in favor of the bill is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff are authorized to make technical or conforming changes, and members have 2 days to file views on the reported measure. Chair wishes to alert members the next vote will be our last vote. Should you choose to exit the hearing room after you vote, please do so quietly. I now call up H.R. 4537. The clerk will designate the bill by title.
H.R. 4537, to preserve the state-based system of insurance regulation and provide greater oversight of and transparency on international insurance standards setting process and for other purposes.
The question is now reporting the bill as amended favorably to the House. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. McHenry. Aye. Mr. McHenry, aye. Mr. King. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Royce. Mr. Royce, no. Mr. Lucas. Mr. Lucas, aye. Mr. Pierce. Mr. Pierce, aye. Mr. Posey. Mr. Posey, aye. Mr. Lukemeyer. Mr. Lukemeyer, aye. Mr. Huizenga. Mr. Huizenga, aye. Mr. Duffy. Mr. Duffy, aye. Mr. Stivers. Mr. Stivers, aye. Mr. Holgren. Mr. Hochran, aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, aye. Mr. Pittenger. Mr. Pittenger, aye. Mrs. Wagner. Mrs. Wagner, aye. Mr. Barr. Mr. Barr, aye. Mr. Rothfuss. Mr. Rothfuss, aye. Mr. Messer. Mr. Messer, aye. Mr. Tipton. Mr. Tipton, aye. Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams, aye. Mr. Poliquin. Mr. Poliquin, aye. Mrs. Love. Mrs. Love, aye. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, aye. Mr. Emmer. Mr. Emmer, aye. Mr. Zeldin. Mr. Zeldin, aye. Mr. Trott. Mr. Trott, aye. Mr. Loudermilk. Mr. Loudermilk, aye. Mr. Mooney. Mr. Mooney, aye. Mr. MacArthur. Mr. MacArthur, aye. Mr. Davidson. Mr. Davidson, aye. Mr. Budd. Mr. Budd, aye. Mr. Kustoff. Mr. Kustoff, aye. Ms. Tenney. Ms. Tenney, aye. Mr. Hollingsworth. Mr. Hollingsworth, aye. Ms. Waters. Ms. Waters, aye. Mrs. Maloney. Mrs. Maloney, no. Ms. Velasquez. Mrs. Velasquez, no. Mr. Sherman. Sherman, aye. Mr. Meeks. Mr. Meeks, no. Mr. Capuano. Mr. Capuano, aye. Mr. Clay. Mr. Clay, aye. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Lynch, aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, aye. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver, aye. Ms. Moore. Ms. Moore, aye. Mr. Ellison. Mr. Ellison, aye. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Himes. Mr. Himes, aye. Mr. Foster. Mr. Foster, aye. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, aye. Mr. Delaney. Mr. Delaney, aye. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Sinema, aye. Mrs. Beatty. Mrs. Beatty, aye. Mr. Heck. Mr. Heck, aye. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Vargas, aye. Mr. Gottheimer. Mr. Gottheimer, aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, aye. Mr. Chris. Mr. Chris, aye. Mr. Kewen. Mr. Kewen, aye. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Chairman, aye.
Members who are exiting are requested to exit quietly. Is there any member who has not voted? Is there any member who wishes to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, the ayes are 56 and the nays are 4.
The majority having voted in favor of the bill as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff are authorized to make technical or conforming changes, and members will have 2 days to file views on the reported measure. There being no further pending business, the committee stands adjourned.